It did not start with a speech. It started with a list 5 demands from Washington: dairy, digital media, government procurement, alcohol restrictions, energy, the kind of list that is usually handled quietly, line by line, in sealed rooms where both sides pretend there is still plenty of room to bargain. But this time the list landed in public. And within 24 hours, Mark Carney's answer was effectively no to all 5, not softened, not disguised, not turned into diplomatic fog, just a signal that Canada was no longer willing to negotiate from fear. That is the real story. Not that Trump-S team made demands. The United States has always used pressure inside North American trade talks. The real story is that when those demands arrived, they hit a Canadian system that had already been hardened in advance. That is why this matters so much, because what looks like a routine trade review is actually something much bigger, a test of whether Canada is still structurally dependent enough on the United States to bargain away its pressure points, one by one, or whether it has quietly moved far enough toward economic sovereignty to start refusing the terms altogether. And once you see that, the whole picture changes. The headline says Canada rejected 5 demands. The deeper truth is that Washington discovered those 5 demands were aimed at sectors Ottawa had already started locking down before the demands were formally delivered. That is what turned a trade review into a standoff. Now, the easiest way to understand this is to begin with the most important part of the relationship, because it is also the part Washington did not place first, even though it sits under everything else. Energy: the United States imports roughly 3.8 million barrels of crude oil per Dalton Y from Canada. That is not a side flow. That is around 23% of total American refinery feedstock. And this matters even more when you remember what kind of oil we are talking about. Gulf Coast refineries are built around the chemistry of Canadian heavy sour crude. This is not interchangeable supply you replace with a slogan and a presidential threat. And it is not just oil during winter peaks. New England leans quietly on Canadian electricity imports to keep homes heated and grids stable. That means the energy relationship is not a favor, it is a structural necessity, and that one fact sits underneath every other American demand. Whether Washington wants to say it aloud or not, because once one side knows the other side needs it in ways that cannot be rapidly rewired, the negotiation changes shape. That is the first layer of this story. The second layer is dairy, and dairy matters not because of the money alone, but because it reveals how Canada thinks about sovereignty. American producers have complained for years that Canada's supply management system blocks fair access on paper. The U.S. case is simple. Canadian tariffs on imports above quota can rise beyond 200%, even toward 298% in some categories. That sounds outrageous if you present it abstractly, but inside Canada, that same system is not seen as outrageous at all. It is seen as protection for thousands of farms, especially in Quebec, and as a stabilizer for domestic production in a country that does not want one of its most politically sensitive agricultural sectors turn into collateral damage in a continental pricing war. The crucial change this time is that Ottawa did not just defend supply management rhetorically, it moved to protect it legislatively. That matters enormously, because once the protection is in law, what used to be a bargaining chip becomes a structural constant. It is no longer simply a matter of whether a negotiator wants to give ground. The state has already made the ground harder to yield. That same pattern appears again in digital media. Washington says Canada's online streaming and online news laws discriminate against American platforms like Netflix, Spotify, Google, YouTube, and others by forcing them to reinvest revenue into Canadian content and compensate publishers. Canada says something different. It says those laws are not discrimination. They are cultural survival. That is not just semantics. That is the fight. Because for Washington, this is a tech revenue problem. For Ottawa, it is a sovereignty problem. Who controls the content pipeline, who captures the money, who decides whether a country sitting next to the biggest media machine on earth still gets to sustain a distinct cultural space of its own. Once you frame it that way, the issue stops being a technical trade dispute and becomes something closer to national self-defense through regulation. And again, that is why Carney could reject the demands so quickly. Not because the U.S. complaint was surprising, because Canada had already decided internally that this terrain mattered too much to bargain over lightly. Then comes procurement, and this one is almost embarrassing for Washington. The United States demanded better access for American firms to provincial procurement in places like Ontario, Quebec, and British Columbia. But this demand collapses the moment you hold it next to America's own policy architecture. Buy American rules are not theoretical. They are central federal contracts, military contracts, infrastructure spending, domestic sourcing rules. The United States protects its own industrial base through procurement all the time. So from Canada's point of view, conceding here would not feel like fair reciprocity. It would feel like unilateral disarmament. It would mean giving away a tool that the United States itself continues to use aggressively. That is why this was never likely to move. The alcohol issue looks smaller, but it reveals the sequence problem at the core of the whole standoff. Several Canadian provinces restricted American beer and wine after U.S. tariffs were imposed on Canadian goods. That means the Canadian restrictions were retaliatory. They were not the opening move. So when Washington asks Canada to remove those restrictions without first removing its own tariffs, it is not really negotiating. It is asking for compliance under pressure. That is not how governments behave when they think they still have room to push back. And that is the real theme here. Canada has started behaving like a country that believes pushing back is now structurally possible. Now notice what was not put at the center of the American demand package, autos. That silence matters, because everyone involved understands that the North American auto sector is not a normal trade relationship. It is one integrated machine, parts cross borders repeatedly before final assembly. Canadian plants depend on American components. American plants depend on Canadian components. The system saves tens of billions of dollars because it functions as one industrial organism rather than three isolated national industries. That is why Washington was careful, pushed too hard there, and the damage lands on Detroit as fast as on Ontario. The auto sector is the place where dependence becomes hardest to hide, and once major manufacturers started warning about the cost of instability, the administration faced pressure from its own industrial base to stop treating uncertainty like a negotiating toy. That is the hidden pressure tree underneath the public one, push on dairy. You hit Canadian law, push on media. You hit Canadian identity, push on procurement. You expose American hypocrisy, push on alcohol. You reveal sequencing weakness, push on autos. You hit your own manufacturers. And under all of it sits energy, which the United States cannot replace quickly enough to negotiate as if it were optional. That is what makes this moment different, not the existence of demands. The order in which the demands ran into structural resistance. Now add the most underestimated part of the story. Canada was not only refusing inward, it was already expanding outward. That may be the most important move of all. For decades, Canadian economic policy lived under one giant fact. Roughly 3/4 of Canadian exports went to the United States. That level of concentration created the habit of dependence. And the habit of dependence created the habit of caution. But that is the older version of Canada. The current version has begun to diversify agricultural openings with China, more European positioning, domestic procurement steering, roughly $70 billion toward Canadian suppliers. Coordination between Ottawa and Ontario around auto strategy, a stronger emphasis on critical minerals as leverage in the next industrial age. This is not a total break from the US market. It does not need to be. It only has to be enough to reduce panic, enough to let Ottawa say no without feeling that one refusal equals economic suicide. That is the real shift. And then once that shift becomes visible, the meaning of Carney as rejection changes. It stops looking like emotional defiance. It starts looking like prepared rejection, prepared not in the theatrical sense, but in the structural sense. Policies locked in. Alternatives partially built, risk distributed outward, domestic protection mechanisms reinforced. That is why Carney could reject all 5 demands without appearing improvisational. And this is also why Davos mattered. When Carney said that countries not seated at the table end up on the menu, it was heard in Washington as posture and in much of the rest of the world as a signal. A signal that Canada was no longer speaking as a dependent middle power asking how to preserve access. It was speaking as a country trying to join a wider coalition of states worried about economic coercion and determined to protect room for maneuver before the pressure gets worse. That is a bigger strategic posture than trade. Now bring the focus back to Washington, because this is where the contradiction sharpens. Trump publicly questions whether the deal still matters, but his own trade representative lays out detailed conditions to preserve it. Greer's congressional testimony cites roughly $960 billion in U.S. exports to Canada and Mexico under the agreement and a major increase in exports since implementation. Meanwhile, American industry groups from steel to energy to agriculture to autos are urging continuation and stability. Those things do not fit together cleanly. And that contradiction reveals something important. Washington is not pushing because the agreement is irrelevant. It is pushing because the agreement matters enormously and because the sectors tied to it matter enormously at home. That is why the pressure is so revealing. Every demand was supposed to extract a concession. Instead, each one revealed a dependency. Dairy revealed that Canada had already fenced a domestic system. Digital media revealed how much money and narrative control American platforms stand to lose. Procurement revealed that Canada is learning to keep more capital at home. Autos revealed how integrated the supply chain remains. Energy revealed that the dependence runs south as much as north. This is why the narrative flips when you look at the structure. What appears to be Canadian defiance is actually American transparency. The pressure exposed what Washington lacks. And that is always dangerous in a negotiation, because once the weaker side discovers the stronger side has sectors, it cannot easily escalate against the bargaining balance changes. Now we are moving toward July, when the review point becomes unavoidable. There are really three paths: a full extension, withdrawal, or annual reviews that preserve the agreement in name while stretching uncertainty forward year after year. That last option may look like compromise. In reality, it would act like slow corrosion. Long-term uncertainty is poison for investment, especially in sectors like autos, energy, and industrial planning that require capital decisions years ahead. And here's the irony: if Washington keeps using pressure this way, may accelerate exactly the diversification it says it wants to prevent. That is the bigger consequence. Every additional threat pushes Canada to widen alternatives. Every additional review cycle rewards preparation over accommodation. Every unresolved demand strengthens the case inside Ottawa that flexibility, not dependence, is now the safer model. So the real question is no longer whether Canada rejected 5 demands. The real question is whether Washington has already waited too long, because if Canada has genuinely moved far enough to stop bargaining from fear, then this is not a one-off confrontation. It is the beginning of a different North American model: less automatic dependence, more distributed risk, more domestic hardening, more leverage through refusal. And if that is where this is heading, then Trump S-list did not simply create a standoff. It exposed a shift from a Canada that needed access above all else to a Canada that increasingly believes sovereignty has become economically survivable. That is what changes everything. Not the list, not even the rejection. The fact that the rejection may have been structurally prepared long before the list ever arrived.